Welcome back. This is our second online lecture for Intro to Fine Arts. We've begun our discussion about the language of art, and I've hopefully convinced you that this course is worth taking by explaining some of the benefits you can get from studying art, tangible and otherwise. Next, we'll talk about a few more important terms and critical ideas to help make sense of the next few months you'll be exploring this stuff. First up, form and content. Every work of art includes both of these elements. It's like two sides of a coin. Form describes how it looks, its physical properties. The content is what the art says, the meaning or meanings conveyed by the work, the story behind it, the story it tells. Together, these two words play a very crucial role in what art is and what makes it special. Let's look at form. Form describes the physical properties of the artwork. It could be the medium, like the format, is it painting, is it sculpture, etc. It also refers to the visual elements and design principles. We'll talk a lot about these, but all of these are part of form, but they suggest content. The visual elements. These 8 terms will be a part of practically every discussion we have throughout this course. These are the most fundamental building blocks of our visual experience. The analogy, of course, comes from the periodic table of elements. In regards to matter, the physical stuff of our universe, the elements in the periodic table represent the extent one can break down and analyze everything that exists. If you go beyond the level of the elements, it's all protons, neutrons, and electrons. Turtles all the way down. Well, the visual elements are the same, but applied to our subjective visual experience of the world around us. Line, shape and form, space, texture, pattern, movement, value, and color. First up, line. Line is any identifiable path created by a moving point in space. It's one-dimensional on one hand, it's extended point, but it can vary in length, width, and direction in all practical purposes. Line can define the edge of a form. Line can move the viewer's eye throughout the composition in a work of art. Look at your surroundings, where you are right now. Notice that you could, theoretically, break down everything you see in terms of line. There are lines that define the edges of your computer monitor, lines that delineate your hands from the desk or table beneath them, lines that describe the surface of your shirt and pants, if indeed you are wearing pants. My point is, everything you see can be described with line. And indeed, the medium of drawing often utilizes line to bring people or objects to life, or to convey certain emotional states. Perhaps the most important concept that deals with this visual element is line quality. Line quality is really any adjective that describes how a mark exists in a work of art. Is the use of line precise? Is it sketchy? Is the line dark or light or thick or thin, or slow or fast. The list could go on and on. So it's a simple term to understand, line quality. Literally any word you use to describe the use of line is describing the line quality. On the right is a drawing by Alberto Giacometti. How would you describe the line quality in his work? How does his use of line affect the meaning of this drawing? Shape and form. This involves a perception of enclosure, and it can happen in many ways. Technically, shape is a two-dimensional term. Any enclosed area in a two-dimensional surface is referred to as shape. Form is three-dimensional. An enclosed area of volume can be seen from multiple sides, is referred to as form. But these terms are usually used interchangeably, and so those distinctions don't always bear out when people are actually talking about these things. Often shape is divided into two categories, each with all sorts of associations, sometimes societal, possibly biological, evolutionary. Geometric shapes are usually hard, precise, edged, often straight lines or a very controlled curve, like a perfect circle. Usually include angles, often right angles. And the associations we make with these geometric shapes, maybe a bit anal, certainly masculine in a stereotypical sense. Organic shapes are curvilinear. They're flowing, usually irregular, kind of natural looking, maybe associated with nature and feminine things. But of course, many associations are driven by what we're indoctrinated into by the dominant culture we grew up in. Many artists question these assumptions and point out the contradictions in our cultural experience. Here we see Frederick Hammersley paintings on the left, and on the right, installations by Adrian Butler, who happens to teach here at Texas State. Just like with line, you can look at the world around you and break it up into a set of enclosed areas, shapes. In fact, in our visual experience, these shapes form an interlocking plane. Light comes screaming into your nervous system through your eyes, and these photons are projected onto the back of your eyeball for receptors to pick up and send to your brain for interpretation. That's fundamentally a two-dimensional experience, as the back of your eyeballs are a curved plane. While the world we walk around in contains three dimensions, vision really only happens in two dimensions. It's only because of the ability of our lenses to bend and the fact that we have two separate eyes, a condition called stereoscopic vision, that we can elicit a sensation of three-dimensionality in our vision. When you look around the room you're in, notice that there is no background or foreground in purely visual terms. Everything you see hits your eyes at the same time. Everything is a set of interlocking flat shapes in your vision. It's only because, since you've been a baby crawling around and seeing how the relationships between objects changes as you move, and the imprint of that experience repeated over and over and over again, that we perceive depth. In fact, this notion of depth plays an important role in our next visual element. Next we have space. And space describes a whole area or distance between things. This can involve a two-dimensional, three-dimensional sense of area. Sculpture, architecture, performance art. These mediums deal with actual three-dimensional space. Painting, photography, film, video games, printmaking, drawing, etc. These deal in a specific way, in a literal way. They deal with two-dimensional space, even though they can refer to the illusion of three-dimensional space. And this is where the way that the term also refers to that effect of creating a sense of three dimensions in a two-dimensional medium, the illusion of depth. This concept of the illusion of depth in a two-dimensional artwork has a sort of outsized impact on art history. This is something that certainly the ancient Greeks understood and incorporated into their two-dimensional art, but it was the Renaissance that came along and really perfected this. But this idea centers around creating this feeling that when you're looking at this two-dimensional object, like a painting or a photograph or a computer screen, that what it really seems to be is a window where a whole world opens up on the other side. This whole three-dimensional space where it's tactile, it's convincing. There are strategies that artists have used all through the ages, at least since the ancient Greeks, to try to make this illusion happen. And collectively, these are referred to as the spatial devices. Linear perspective is probably the most famous of these. It's the idea of like if you see the rails on this train track, how these rails get closer and closer together as it gets further away from you in space. And you know logically that these rails are the same distance apart the whole way. But because visually they get closer together, it makes it feel like it's moving away from you in space. It's receding from the viewer. Foreshortening is another one. The way that things tend to look larger when they're closer to you, or when lengths kind of compress. And so, for instance, if you look at the railroad ties here, they're probably, I don't know, like 6 feet long, and they're a certain distance on this slide. Depending on what you're looking at, it might be like 4 or 5 inches or whatever. If you look at the rails, if you go that same distance up from the bottom to the top, it's a similar amount of inches as the railroad ties are from left to right, but it's an incredibly further amount of space, like perhaps like, I don't know, like maybe a quarter of a mile. So foreshortening refers to how these lateral links kind of compress when you see them at an oblique angle. Atmospheric perspective describes the way air particles disrupt the photons of light. So the light comes from the sun in this photograph here. It hits the railroad ties right up close to us, and then bounces off that, hits us in the eye, and it moves through space. It moves through air from the railroad tie to your eye, but not a whole lot. And so that photon remains relatively clean, and that translates into a lot of contrast and precision and detail when we see the image. But if you look at the railroad tracks far away on the horizon, you see those trees back there, you notice that the amount of contrast is significantly less. The amount of detail is significantly less. It's as if all the light waves get distorted or get bounced around by the air that they pass through. That's atmospheric perspective. And that creates a real compelling sense of depth in a photograph like this. There's also overlapping. It's pretty self-explanatory. Like if one thing is partially covering another, then probably the thing doing the covering is closer to you. And that creates a spatial relationship between those two objects. So you can see like on the far left, that pole, that metal pole that sticks up, and the way it covers up the bushes behind it, well, that tells us that pole is closer to us than those bushes. Collectively, the spatial devices are a massive preoccupation of artists in the Western world ever since the Renaissance. Artists either try to do what they can to create this illusion, where like a painting could be a window, or they do whatever they can to fight against that illusion and to emphasize the flatness of a painting. Texture refers to the surface quality of a work of art. The clear analogy here is to the sense of touch. In fact, texture is sort of an indirect visual element It really applies to your memory ever since you were a little baby of touching things, feeling what they felt like, and seeing what they look like, and then drawing the connection between those two. This can be actual texture in some works of art where the surface maybe is like bumpy, or maybe it's like really smooth. But the actual texture describes what the physical object is. But then there's the illusion of texture or implied texture. Kind of like what we talked about with depth. There could be, like the photograph we looked at in the last slide, like was just a flat photograph, or, well, more specifically, a flat image on a computer monitor. But the picture itself gave us the impression that it was a window that had a whole world opening up in three-dimensional space behind it. Well, with texture, it's a similar thing. You can have like a photograph of a really textual object, like the fur on a kitty cat, or the bark on a pine tree. Even though the photograph itself, if you felt it, would be like smooth, but the picture gives you the impression of a rich kind of textural surface. In this Anselm Kiefer painting, we see actual texture, and it happens because he's using a whole variety of like very physical materials on the surface of this canvas. There's lead, there's this paint, there's ash, plaster, cement, dirt, varnish, and canvas all stretched in put on top of this wood panel. The physical presence of this is like you're inferring it because you're seeing a digital image here, but if you see this piece in real life, it like literally kind of pokes out, it has relief. It's like it's almost sculptural as a painting. And Anselm Kiefer is one of my favorite artists, and definitely an example of an artist who really embraces the use of actual texture in his work. Kind of similar to Lucian Freud, the painting we looked at earlier. Number 5 is pattern. And that's the repetition of really any visual element spatially laid out before you. Usually we think of it as a repetition of shape. Think of a grid, or repeating chevrons, or a quilt sewed by your grandmother. Next is movement. And that's this visual sense of motion in front of you. This kind of like texture or shape, or space rather, this can be implied or literal. Media like film, performance, video games, kinetic sculpture, sculpture that moves. These things can involve actual movement. But movement can still be an important part of static media like painting or photography or printmaking. Movement is implied in this illustration of a dancer. How is this movement implied? Well, you have this repeating kind of linear form in the arms, kind of like tracers kind of going off. Is a sense of it elicits this physiological like feeling that these arms are moving, even though of course it's a static two-dimensional image. So this gets a little confusing, but hang with me. Number 7 and 8 are value and color. And I'm including these together in one slide because these could really be considered one visual element. But often in our culture, they're separated out into two for a couple of specific reasons that we'll talk about. But value, sometimes called tone, is part of color, but is often considered separately. This is the lightness and darkness of your visual experience. So regardless of what color it is, How light or dark it is your perception of value. So imagine like a black and white movie. All the colors that were filmed are reduced to just a single continuum from light to dark. You know, that's what black and white imagery is, and photography is another medium that embraces black and white as a color scheme as well. Maybe I would say, of course, as a painter, that these two visual elements together, and you could really just think of this as color and the full dimensions of color, that this is really the most important visual element of them all, because pure vision is a product of light, which translates in our sensation as color. The frequency of the light wave is the hue, and the amount of that and the intensity of that is what informs our color perception. If we think of color as a whole, including value, we find three separate dimensions that make up our experience of color. It's interesting because in our society, in our culture, we have this one word for visual experience, color, that really speaks to three separate dimensions. And that's important, and it's also explains why communicating about color can be so confusing and mystifying, because it's as if we're like using this one word to take the place of three separate entities, and that makes it really hard. So these entities are hue, value, and intensity. The hue is like technically the specific wavelength of light that if this photon is coming from the sun and bouncing off a tree and then flying through the air and hitting us in the eyeball, all these wavelengths of light except for this green have been absorbed into that tree, and the green reflects off and hits us in the eye. And so that narrow range of frequency in the electromagnetic spectrum is what we perceive of as hue. It's like an individual spoke on the color wheel. So value, as we've already talked about, is how light or dark that experience of color is, or that experience of light is. So imagine like a really light green or a really dark green. They could be the same hue, but they'd be radically different value. Then there's intensity, also called saturation and sometimes called chroma. This is how vibrant that color experience is. In the sense of physics, it's also like the purity of that wavelength of light. So how much green we experience in that experience of green. This is hard to describe in words, but like if you look at the word intensity on the screen, that's a relatively high intensity green. But you can imagine if I tone that back to be like a hunter's green, or like the green of like an army green or something, it would be the same hue. It could even be the same value, but it would be a radically different intensity, much more neutralized. And so there's this whole range with all three of these dimensions. And that's really what makes color such a complicated issue to talk about. And also the subject of like countless books. People spend their whole lives studying color and still can't really, really understand or convey that understanding. Let's just say it's complicated. One individual who's done a lot to help us make sense of our color experience is Albert Henry Munsell. And in the late 1800s, he developed this model for understanding the three separate dimensions of color. You have how light or dark it is all along this core, kind of going up gets lighter, down gets darker, around this band. As you move around it, the hue changes. So think of that as a color wheel, that dimension. And you have all these different hues and separating these groups of hues. And then as you move out from the core toward the edge, you have the changes in intensity. So in this particular example, we see this one like kind of piece of a pie out of this, three-dimensional volume of color. We have this one like kind of wedge shape. It represents a single value, like somewhere in the middle, and it represents a single hue, a purplish blue, and then it represents all these different iterations of intensity that are the same amount of lightness / darkness, and also the same amount, or rather the same exact like kind of frequency of light. But you can see even with the same value and the same hue, there's a whole range of different color experiences that can come from this. And so when you think about it, the capacity for us to experience different colors is absolutely immense, like millions and millions and millions of different colors we can see, and you can imagine any one of them. You can imagine being plotted along this model that Albert Munsell came up with. And this marks the end of our second lecture on the language of art. Next, we'll talk about what happens when you put all these visual elements together. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon.